Okay, welcome to Horse Geeks, where we look at horses, the Horse Geeks podcast, sorry. Welcome to the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer for Wexford Training and developer of the program Training for Optimal Balance. And with me, as usual, I have the lovely Deb Romero, who is an orthopedic massage therapist, Alexander Technique certified instructor, and founder of her business, Optimal Posture. So today's topic for the podcast is titled Stability in Motion. And what does that mean? We kind of get to pick up from our last podcast where we just started to touch on that conversation about the axial skeleton's relationship to gravity during motion. And we're going to break that down and say that's a little bit of a mouthful. So we'll break that down. But why don't we start? And Deb, you have sort of more the anatomy background. So can you explain the two skeletons that make up the two segments of our skeleton, as they're just the center skeleton versus the limbs, and what those are called, how that works?
I'll try to dust off those cobwebs from anatomy. So what we talked about last time was the axial skeleton, which
What
your
is
center, your spine, your head, neck, back, and pelvis. That is like, and I think, and I wonder if we think about this with our horses too, we kind of get the perception that our spine is on our back, and it's really not. It's very centrally located. And as riders, I think I've always been taught the ear over the shoulder, over the hip kind of thing. So if you think about it, the body of your spine is in the closer to the middle of your body.
Yeah, geographically centered in the body. Yeah, because we can feel the spinous processes in our back, and we think that's where our spine is. But those are just the little, in the horse, they're called the dorsal tips of the spine, or the spinous processes. And in us, they're the back or the posterior side of the body.
So if you reach back there, it's just the little bumps you feel. And we kind of lose sight of where our actual spine is. So if we can change our thinking that it's closer to the center of our body, that to me gives me a better idea of support. And stabilizing the axial spine is key for coordinating movement. So that axial spine supports the appendages. So you can kind of think of a worst case scenario for a human. Everybody can get this visual of somebody with a walker. They have lost all spinal integrity or support, and they're balancing off their arms and legs.
Yeah, so let me drop back a second, because I actually made sure I looked it up and had an accurate definition. But the axial skeleton is the skull, the spine, and the rib cage. And then the appendicular skeleton, by appendages, includes the shoulder blades, so the scapula, the arms, the pelvis, and the legs. And I always think of the axial skeleton from a functional perspective. I include the skull, the spine, the pelvis. But technically, it's the skull, the spine, and the rib cage is the axial skeleton. I think the scapula, the shoulder blades, and the pelvis are sort of these transitional bones, very important transitional bones between the axial skeleton and the appendages, the arms and the legs. And so,
that's a really good way to look at it, because they're, like you said, they're kind of transition areas.
Yeah.
Where you're coming off of the axial skeleton and you're adding these appendages.
Right. So the scapula, and this is true whether I'm thinking about the human anatomy or the horse anatomy. So the horse anatomy, we call it the shoulders, the scapula that sort of sit like this in front of the saddle, that are really the top of their front legs. And anatomically, the horse's front legs are the equivalent to the human arms. So the front legs include the scapula, the radius, the ulna, the what we call the knee, the front knee of the horse is technically the carpus. It's really the wrist, right? And then the cannon bones and the lower leg bones are like our hand bones. And then in the hind legs of the horse, that's where the pelvis is, the femur, the stifle is the knee joint, the hock is the technically like the human ankle joint, and then the fetlock is like a knuckle joint on our foot. So if we just take the human anatomy and sort of flip it horizontal, they still have an axial skeleton, skull, spine, rib cage, and appendicular skeleton, the front legs being the arms, the hind legs being the legs. And I do like that idea of the scapula and the pelvis being sort of these, because they're both huge bony structures. The scapula are quite large and the pelvis is quite large. It's a lot of bone that acts as a stabilizing force for the limbs. So I think that's why sometimes we include it from a functional point of view as part of the axial skeleton, because it really does help support the stability of the limbs the closer you are to that axial part of the skeleton.
Yeah.
I wanted to define that so as we go on using these words that people understand what the axial skeleton is. And then it fascinated me, if you think of it, it was named axial skeleton because that's the word for axis, or everything in the body revolves around this axis. So thinking of the alignment of the skull and the spine, I'm going to take the ribs out of it, because if you have the spine properly aligned with gravity and in a proper internal alignment, the ribs sort of fall in place. And I do like to include the pelvis, especially for riders, because that's what we're really balancing on in the saddle. So that axial skeleton, if we take, and you're saying anatomically, it's actually correct, from the middle of the top of our head down between our seat bones, or the lower bones of the pelvis, that's about where our spine is actually located. It's
Exactly.
not behind the skull.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting that reference, I think, could be very helpful for riders and non-riders to realize that it functions much closer to the center of your body than it does on your back. And, it's not your back.
Right.
It's not on your back.
It also houses body organs or parts that are vitally important to our survival. So our skull and spine are the bony protections of our central nervous system. That's pretty important. Without it, we can't function at all, or we lose our mobility. If our spinal cord is severed at any place, we can lose mobility entirely. So thinking of the skull and the spine as important bony structures protecting the central nervous system, and then the rib cage is really a protection for many of our vital organs, right? And then the pelvis actually sort of stabilizing, protecting our reproductive system and part of our digestion. So these are very important functional parts of our body that nature provided bony protection for. And so that axis, that central line of the torso, the head and torso, taking out the arms and legs, whether it's a horse on a horizontal plane or a human on a vertical plane, that relationship, that's first internally stabilizing and sort of stacking that alignment of all those little, like all the joints in the vertebra give us the ability to adapt and move while still protecting the spinal cord. but they can also misalign a little bit, or they can get out of whack, or they can get stressed. And so the internal alignment of our head, neck, or head and spine and pelvis is kind of how we manage the internal forces. But then once we're in motion, we might have forces acting to push or pull. And so we also have to manage external forces.
Yeah, and that comes into, I was looking at different definitions of postural tone, and I came up with a new one that postural tone needs to be a state of readiness, not a state of muscular tension. So it has to be adaptable to internal forces, external forces, and be able to move and function in all that. And I think I'm wondering, because I know in the hunter world where I used to show you, they used to say we want it to have a frame. We want the horse to be framed. And I find that word very interesting, because we have an internal representation of our body that the motor control system taps into, and that's called our body schema. Mm-hmm. So, and what the body schema does is it's like a detailed reference manual so it's kind of like what we started all about is working from the inside out, because we're trying to go in, like you said, the operating systems, we're trying to go in and redo pages in the manual.
Yes.
And that goes into for me, the difference between superficial muscles and deep muscles. And I've always used different language. I've always used language like the postural muscles are deep to the bone. And the new scientific evidence is very supportive of that. The deeper muscles next to the bones are shorter. So they have more control and they don't cross as many joints. Whereas the superficial muscles, kind of like the ones we can see, the bicep, the triceps, and all of that, they are crossing many joints. They're long, so they cannot provide postural support like the intrinsic internal muscles can. So, and we can't see those. We can't. So how do we play with those?
It brings up a very interesting point, because if we look at a body in motion, stability, just like these like bony structures that are meant to protect our most vital body parts, when we're in motion and we're just going around day to day, we have to move, horses have to move. So once we're in motion, the body requires stability in order to function. So stability is a sort of hierarchically a primary requirement, where moving correctly or in balance or in efficient use is lower in that hierarchy. Because in order to survive, you just have to be able to stabilize your body in motion to get things done. Otherwise, it would be jello just wiggling all over the place, right? So stability is a requirement of a body in motion. And when we talk about improving balance, I think what that means is learning to find stability through the axial skeleton, through the use of the deeper muscles. Otherwise, if that central part of the body becomes unstable, then the outer part of the body automatically kicks in to find stability. So if the deeper muscles are not organizing that axial skeleton in a stable relationship internally, and then aligning with gravity while in motion, and we'll get back to that later, but let's just talk about internal alignment, because everybody knows chiropractors are supposed to put you back in line, so we know then it goes out of line, right? So if we move in a way where our head, our skull, our spine, our pelvis are not in a healthy alignment relative to each other, then the limbs or the appendicular skeleton kicks in to find stability. And it's not even in our conscious awareness most of the time.
No, the postural tone is a subconscious event. It's, it's a planned thing. And that's what you're doing with horses, and what Alexander teachers are doing is tapping into that. What do we need to change in the manual or whatever to get better organization at the axial level,
Right.
so that the limbs do what they need to do.
That actually, because I look at it as these sort of two options within the body. You have the axial skeleton option and you have the appendicular option. And that's why medically they separate those segments of the skeleton. It's a medical term, separation. And so if the axial skeleton, for some reason, becomes unstable, the limbs kick in. But if we're just simply unaware that our axial skeleton is unstable or in a poor alignment to gravity, then we suffer from things like shoulder arthritis and chronic tension and sore knees and overusing muscles and all of that stress and strain in the limbs, whether it's arms or legs, or chronic muscle overcontraction, where the muscles are working really hard. That's because it's, even if we don't know that our axial skeleton is not aligned or stable, the soreness or overuse of the outer muscles tells us that is so, right? So when we're super sore in the outer muscles, it means the inner muscles are not really doing their job. And as soon as you swap that around, whether it's through the Alexander technique training for people or what I do with horses, the more stability you create through the alignment of the skull, the spine, and pelvis, and stability there, it's like you gave the limbs a massage. You don't have to make the tension go away. It just literally melts instantaneously at the same rate that that stability comes back to the central axis.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to that, the how the horse is responding. If it's out of whack and it's axial skeleton, you not only may see lameness, you may see personality, what we call personality traits, or you can speak to that a lot better than I can, but it just may be the central nervous system, the motor system. It's just telling the brain, hey, we're out of whack here in the back and we need to fix it.
Yeah. And let me make one more point, and then I will follow up with what you just said, because that's super important, how it relates to the emotional state.
Yes.
But I found it really ironic that when it comes to horses, keeping the head, spine, and pelvis straight and level was the fastest way to create suppleness in all of the other outer muscles. And it's still a really popular belief to stretch the horse. Do you know what I mean? Like really overbend the neck laterally or downward, or do these stretches in order to supple muscles, or have a massage therapist come in and supple the muscles. And I go, oh, I'm not against any of that, but the need to do that constantly is telling you that the axial skeleton is not stable. And so you're fighting the body constantly overly contracting these outer muscles, because the root cause is stability has to come somewhere, and it's not happening where it should.
Right.
So I found that when people ask me, they're bending their horse around, doing all this lateral work or bending the neck and doing stretches, and I go, straight is what gives you supple muscles, not bending. Bending actually can destabilize the axial skeleton to the point that the outer muscles contract even more, not less.
And that's the same in people.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen riders, I don't know how to explain it, but they, if they're not balancing here through their axial skeleton, they're balancing off their hands.
Yes. Or
and
their
you can,
feet in the stirrups.
right, they brace.
Yeah.
And so therefore they can be moved quite a bit. And I have found the more I focus on internally balancing my own spine, the quieter and the more access I have to my own limbs.
Yes.
So, and maybe we could talk about what does stability feel like? What does it feel like when you're on a horse, a stable environment?
I think stability, even in motion, is an absence of, it's an absence of forces acting against our stability. So it's like stability equals stillness or quietness, but that doesn't mean it can't be in motion.
Exactly.
Right. So like a regular tempo in a walk or in music, it creates a stillness within the motion because of the consistency. And so when we feel unstable, it's because our body is being challenged either with internal forces or external forces that are pushing and pulling, sort of threatening our relationship to gravity. Right? So what stability feels like a horse that's really moving in balance, there's an absence of force acting on the rider from the saddle. So the flexion or the proper use, the stability of the axial skeleton in the horse, coupled with increasing the flexion or lifting upward force of the spine, means that the saddle does not move. So instead of feeling like you have to go to the gym and learn how to get strong in order to sit the trot, a good trot is easy to sit. You don't work hard at all because the horse's back is so stable. And particularly in a quadruped, like we forget that in a biped, we have these 4 natural curves that are part of being vertical. But in a quadruped, like a horse, the thoracolumbar spine acts as kind of the most stable central organizing part of the horse's 4 limbs. So for the human, because we're vertical, we have these curves in our spine and the pelvis becomes part of the base of support, right? But in the horse, the pelvis acts more like a leg bone. It's not a huge base of support. So it's actually the thoracolumbar spine. And then that system of muscles and connective tissue and tendons and ligaments is more reticular in a horse. That's why they can be these mammoth animals that can move at high speeds for long distances.
With these little bitty legs.
Little bitty legs. And
Little
there's
bitty legs compared to what this whole mass is that's on top of it.
yeah, there's zero muscle from the middle leg joint to the hoof on all 4 legs. It's all tendon, ligament, bone, fascia. And so how do they do that? So the central bony organization in the horse is the thoracolumbar spine. And then their cervical spine, the neck, is very long with a very big, heavy skull, so that as they evolved, they can see predators, they're highly mobile, and they can eat from above or below. And so it serves them in their evolution, but it's a problem when we ride them to have this really long neck with a big, heavy, bony skull at the end is what they have to learn to cope with by using the back muscles and using the hindquarter muscles to offset that sort of a long neck and unsupported weight up front. So the stability of the thoracolumbar spine and how the rider helps stabilize the alignment of the skull and the cervical spine to the thoracolumbar spine. I go, that's paramount for the horse finding any stability in motion, especially with weight on their back. And that's
and you had mentioned that when you get on a green horse, and I've felt that it's been many years since I've gotten on a green horse, but that you explain it, that in a, that kind of falling everywhere to try to stabilize all of this new stuff.
They absolutely, as soon as a human sits on a horse, we destabilize the horse's axial skeleton. Boom, gonna happen, right? We're now putting an unnatural weight on their back. So I've started a lot of young horses, and I don't care the breed or how much groundwork you did before, or how well muscled they are, or what even their age is, whether you start them young or 5 or 6 or 7 years old. The first ride, when they get a rider on their back for the first time, they all stagger. Like they sort of don't know where their feet go. They feel incredibly unstable for that first few minutes. And then how the rider sits and acts with them can be really critical to them figuring out, oh, okay, I can do this. It's hard, but I can do it and I feel okay about it. Or we can push them and they either will gravitate into just going faster, 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 trying to find stability, or they'll refuse to move forward because they feel so unstable. Right. And it's
I had both.
steering is a bit wonky. The speed is sort of like, somebody learning to drive a clutch. And they're just all unstable because it's unnatural to have a rider on the back. And so
Right.
Learning to carry a rider is a learned skill for every horse. And dynamically, we are a mass and weight. We're a living mass and weight. So if you put a living mass and weight straddling their axial skeleton, right where everything organizes, the first thing we're going to do is make them unstable. So,
and I can't imagine if we're not organized. We're bringing our messy stuff for them to have to handle.
Right.
If we haven't figured out our own organization off the horse, then adapting to the horse.
And the rider's stability is probably the most important factor. The rider's stability, especially of their own skull, spine, pelvis. Even if you sit a little too far back or a little too far forward, if the rider stabilizes their body alignment, mostly vertical over gravity, then we don't end up as riders over contracting our arms, over contracting the legs or anything else. But even if we contract and we don't do it well, like we don't do it in a mechanically ideal way, a rider who's learned to become stable is the most beneficial for a horse.
I think what you just mentioned that is so really resonates with me, and I need to hear it over and over and over again, is the rider needs to stabilize with gravity, not with the horse.
Yeah.
Can you I mean, like that? Because I've always been taught, that saying, move with the horse. Well, what if the horse isn't moving correctly? You're just exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, I mean we could do a whole podcast.
We could do a whole podcast on that one. But that I think if
tell riders
do that.
Because the way we're trained to ride is to sort of find our place in the saddle, in the stirrups, on the reins, and not really think about the horse that's under the saddle or the gravity that's under the horse. Right? So when we think of aligning, we are vertically shaped creatures as humans. That means our axial skeleton, in order to balance, has to have fundamentally a vertical relationship to gravity, right? So we can, like if you're in a racing seat or jumping seat, your axial skeleton is at a 45-degree angle to gravity, right? And then the legs act as levers. So that's why you ride with short stirrups. But let's just say, green horse riding, you ride in a more vertical position. So our relationship, aligning our skull, our spine, and our pelvis over gravity thinking through the saddle, through the horse. Gravity.
Yes.
That alignment, sort of like we become the carousel pole in the middle of the horse.
Oh, I like that one.
Right?
Yeah.
So that alignment, it's the same way that people get their sea legs. Right? So when you go on a boat, the first time I went on a boat, you grip the rail, you get seasick, you grip with your appendicular skeleton, and you find out that
you're all over the place. You're all over the place.
And if you try to move with the boat, you're going to find yourself falling off pretty quick. So what you actually do is you work against the forces of the water that are acting on the boat, and you constantly realign yourself to gravity. So they say, like, look at the horizon to sort of find your balance on a boat, which is it's a stability in motion when you get your sea legs. So that's probably the best analogy for really learning to ride a horse well, is the horse is the water and the saddle is the boat. And we have to get our sea legs on these two little bony protrusions at the bottom of our pelvis, the ischium, called seat bones, right? So we're just balancing on these two little knobby points of our pelvis. And so it's balancing our torso, not having to grip with our arms and legs. If our torso is aligned over gravity, just like getting your sea legs, then you can adapt to the movement of the horse. If the horse moves well, it's like getting your sea legs on a calm, clear lake. When you're starting a green horse under saddle, you better be able to be out there with deadliest catch, right? So you better be able to sort of adjust to bigger forces of motion, because the horse won't be stable yet.
Yeah, and I think that definition of readiness instead of muscular effort and tension is really important. And when I get on to ride, I always say to myself, are all my joints open and available? If some, that just keeps me from, gripping with the reins or gripping with my legs. I'm always checking in to say, oh, elbows and wrists, is it all available? If I had to do an emergency landing,
yeah. And
am I going to not hurt myself?
Especially when I was, giving myself lessons, so to speak, I would go, oh, there goes that old habit of jamming my heels down.
Yeah.
That tells me I need to come back and think of the central axis of force. And am I behind the vertical line of gravity? Am I ahead of the vertical line of gravity? Am I off to the left or the right? And so I would notice myself pulling on the reins or jamming my feet in the stirrups or closing in my thighs like I was squishing a tube of toothpaste. And all of those things, I just use them rather than saying, don't do that. That only makes you do it more, right? So instead I would go, my appendicular skeleton is going to kick in automatically when my axial skeleton becomes unstable or falls out of a proper alignment to gravity. And here I am just coping with the forces of motion in the horse. That's kind of all consuming for your attention, right? So it kicks in before you know what happened. You're gripping somewhere. And the gripping, rather than trying to say, don't grip, your body will not listen to that. I go, you have to transfer that muscular activity, that muscular energy has to be directed to the center, right? So I just redirect it rather than fighting it.
I like that language, redirecting and adapting. And I'm always asking the questions, what is that telling me? And it always brings me back, like you said, to what's going on in my axial skeleton, because that's where you can make the changes that, and we've seen it, I've seen it in people and I've felt it, and you've seen it in horses. When you address that, everything else goes away.
And I'm going to repeat, that's why it's called the axis, the axial skeleton, the axis of the body. because when that is stable and in motion, it's kind of a minute little adjustment to keep lining up to gravity. Just like when you're on a boat, you're never fully static. You're always adapting in subtle ways to keep that vertical stability with gravity. And when you do that, the outer muscles or the muscles of the limbs relax, the joints of the shoulders, the arms, the legs, the hips become open and available. Everything can sort of move around and adjust around this stable center. And as soon as the center is not stable or not in a good relationship with gravity, everything on the outer part of the body is going to grip and fill in, because the body needs stability one way or the other. Otherwise, we're falling and we're getting injured and it's no good, right? So, and the body instinctually seeks stability somehow. So realizing, like, I think that's why I used to look like my legs were so much shorter, was all gripping. I had to look up the muscle, the sartorius.
It's the sartorius you were talking about last time, yeah.
Yeah. So I had a which is a very long muscle.
Very long and crosses the hip and the knee.
Yeah. So that sartorius muscle was gripping because my lumbar was always a bit too far forward in its natural curve. It was exaggerated. And so it was like my body was constantly having to adapt for that habitual misalignment of my axial skeleton. So interesting.
Yes.
I'm not sure which way to go from here, because we did talk a little bit about a rider on a horse is immediately going to challenge the horse's stability. And how we ride is super important. You just like thinking even of getting your sea legs. If you were just a torso and you had no arms and no legs, you could balance in the saddle and find your alignment to gravity. And we see it all the time in para riders.
Yeah, we do.
I go, they're amazing. Or we see these people who can stand on a horse at a full gallop, right? Or do all kinds of gymnastics on the back of a moving horse. And that's because they have a very good awareness and control of finding that relationship to gravity and navigating the forces of motion at the same time. So the other thing we touched on, before we leave this topic, you did mention something that I didn't really respond to, which is how we're told to move with the horse.
Yeah, I love that one.
Yeah. And I go, well,
do we want to touch on that?
I really want to do that on its own. Maybe we'll do a stability in motion too as a podcast.
Yeah, maybe, because there's a lot of language.
That's a big one. And
huge.
I'm just going to touch on it because it's not entirely wrong, the concept of moving with the horse. But it's, again, I'm going to go back to my getting your sea legs analogy. When you are on the boat, you are constantly adapting and moving, but it's more soft tissue than it is your axial skeleton wiggling all over the place, right? You're shifting weight, you're adjusting muscle tone to actually stabilize the bones of your body, particularly the line of the axial skeleton. So your soft tissue and your weight shifts are what move in order to stabilize your axial skeleton in the context of all these forces of motion. And so getting your sea legs is really the best analogy because we do it automatically. But on the back of a horse, people tend to exaggerate. So people who are told to move with the horse move the skeleton all over the place.
Right.
Right. And that further destabilizes the horse's axial skeleton in a significant way. Significant. Or if we're taught to sit quietly, sit still, we tend to lock the muscles in with the skeleton. So just like the first time I was on a boat, grabbing the rail and stiffening all my muscles just made me wobble more. It didn't make me stable. So that separation of the bones from the soft tissue means, yes, we move with the horse with our soft tissue in order to be still in our skeleton. That's really,
That's a tough one. You know, the language around that is so, because we hear be still all the time.
or move with the horse.
Right. And we don't know how to access that in our bodies unless we're taught.
Right.
Because if we're not balanced in our axial skeleton, our arms and legs take over and we think that's still, when
Right.
it's not. That's muscular tension and stiffness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and nobody tells us, okay, first you have to separate your soft tissue from your hard tissue in your body, because they're going to be doing two different things. If anybody said that, it would have made a lot more sense. Right? But they just say move with the horse or be still, and all of us kind of glue our hard and soft tissues together as one body. So we figure the whole body has to move with the horse, which makes us very unstable, makes the horse unstable, or try to be still, and we end up looking like little ricochet items on the back of a horse, getting
boing,
back.
boing, 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 boing.
Right.
The ponytail block.
It's not,
I remember those days. So, yeah.
So we'll talk about it, but maybe we'll do another podcast on that whole idea of separating the hard and soft tissues for stability, because I wish somebody had told me that a long time ago, because the word language is really important. And that's why people get in these big arguments about sit quietly or move with the horse.
And like you said, that neither one is wrong. It's just we
one.
don't know what that means and how to use our bodies to make that happen.
Right. And just because it's not wrong doesn't mean it's entirely right.
That's true too.
I hate that. So the last point I wanted to bring up about the importance, because stability for the horse is not really often part of the conversation. Like, people assume because they're large animals, they got 4 legs and they're not stumbling and physically falling over, they must be okay. But when we talk about stability the way we're talking about it for humans and through the axial skeleton, I see there is 100% of the time a direct relationship between instability in the horse's axial skeleton and huge, we could call behavioral problems, safety issues, performance issues, these problems that we say the horse has. There's a direct link to them being stable down their center line or not.
Yeah, I read this to you before, and I just, this is in a recent study that they're finding evidence that indicates the axial motor regions may have a large influence in the regulation of the adrenal response to stress.
Yes.
So the axial motor regions, if they're out of whack, they're sending, information to the adrenals. And you know what horses are going to do? It's the fight or flight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and even what you brought up at the beginning, for the human, it takes us much longer because we live, let's say, an average of 100 years, where a horse is going to live an average of 30 years, right? So for the human, it isn't until we get up over 60, maybe 70, 80, 90, that we lose stability to such a significant extent that we need a walker. For some, sooner than others. For some, never do they need a walker, right? But if the use and stability of our axial skeleton becomes compromised and we need a cane, a walker, something like that, one of the greatest fears for older people is falling. And the bones get brittle, the balance becomes challenged, and it gets even, it gets them into a state of perpetual anxiety.
Yeah.
So, and some will, just like horses, there's fight and flight as fear-based behaviors, fear responses instinctually. And I go, you think of the cranky old people and the scared old people. And I go, that's the human equivalent. You know? Yeah. And I go, for a human to have to use a walker, I go, okay, but you can become dependent on it, or you can use it as a tool to rebuild the muscles supporting the axial skeleton. It can be a very necessary tool, but how we use it, right, can make a world of difference into stabilizing our body over gravity for longer, or becoming more and more and more dependent. So just like a horse can become dependent on rein contact or side reins, it's because they're not toned stable through their axial skeleton. So they fall forward, just like a human on a walker. The longer they do that, the less stable the axial skeleton becomes. And as that stability or strength is lost through the midline of the horse along the spine, they are kind of more alert to their surroundings.
Yes.
They get described as ADD. They become hypersensitive or reactive. They become spooky. They have bigger fight or flight responses under pressure. All of that has a direct relationship to the alignment, the stability, the use of that axial skeleton in the horse.
And in even some horses, because you and I have both experienced the ones that are flighty or the ones that stand and fight. And then I know my poor little Plumley, all he wants to do is please everybody, my little halflinger. So he just physically broke down.
Yeah.
The limbs just started breaking down.
Absolutely, because they can only go two ways. The horses that get labeled as bad or difficult or problematic, I go, they just have a stronger sense of self-preservation. When they begin to feel stress or strain or instability in their body, in motion, especially with a rider, they're going to let you know by resisting more, acting out more, getting you off their back, doing what they need to do to protect themselves. And the horses that sort of want to please people more, or they want to get along more, or they just don't want trouble, they're the ones that go left.
Yeah.
Because either way, it's not, the horses that act out are kind of letting you know there's a problem. But the horses
that's kind of like the pain mechanism in people.
Absolutely.
Same thing.
Yeah. And there's also people who quietly go lame. Like they just go, oh, I'm just getting old. You know, I just can't do as much.
Quietly go lame.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that.
Horses like Plumley, he's doing his best. He never gives the rider a speck of trouble.
Never.
But massive damage to his front end lameness, you know, and the front feet, big problem, because that axial skeleton was not stable and in a healthy relationship with gravity, which for horses, the torso of the horse, not the neck and head, just from sort of the withers to the croup or the central line of their torso, should ideally have a parallel relationship over the ground. So it has a horizontal relationship to gravity, where humans have a vertical relationship to gravity as bipeds. But that fear, and it becomes kind of it becomes a negative cycle, because when a horse is startled, or even humans, when we go into fear, we go into longitudinal extension. We extend the spine, and we kind of, in the humans, we arch forward, and in a horse, they drop their back and lift their head. And the more often we go into extension, the side effect of extension is like a hyper rotation, a shaking side to side of the spine. or a rolling side to side of the spine in the horse, which just makes the whole axial skeleton more unstable. So the fear feeds the instability, and then the instability in motion feeds the fear.
Yes.
And that's where you get big problems. That's where the kind of dangerous rides live, or the dangerous horses live, or the daredevil riders live. It's physiological, because you almost can't separate the mental emotional state from the instability or misuse of the axial skeleton. I go, those two things are so intimately linked. And then, and what was the research on the adrenal glands as well?
That's that the axial motor region influence the regulation of the adrenals and their response to stress. So that's kind of like the fear of falling. You know, once you hit that point, the protective mechanism goes off, going, hey, you need to pay attention. And we go into that fight or flight. Usually for us, it's when we get older, it's fear of falling, and we brace.
Yes.
And you know, that's a downward spiral for most.
Yeah. I think we're out of time. Like, this is
Yes.
kind of long, but let's do a stability in motion 2. Yeah. Maybe let's do that next time and carry on with this conversation, because I really feel it's not talked about enough. And the horse's sense of stability in motion makes or breaks performance, lameness, safety issues. I go, it's related to all 3 of those major areas that we have to deal with horses.
I agree.
All right, so let's wrap here. Thank you guys for joining us. Click subscribe if you want to follow the Horse Geeks podcast. And thank you for joining us.
Be kind, everybody.
All right, bye.